Welcome to Humanities West. This is our 2025-2026 season, the first program. And of course, we're going to do it on World War II. This is the exact day, the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. So that's why we picked it. Some of you might have seen there was a special on CNN about this, and they interviewed some sailors who had actually, been involved. So they must be pretty close to 100. So this is pretty much about our parents' generation and what they went through. And I think it's really valuable to pay attention to what our parents' generation went through, because right now, we have these two parties, see everything completely differently. There's been no compromising for quite a while, or very little. And it seems to me, people say, oh, it was the greatest generation and all that kind of stuff. They were different. They weren't like normal human beings. They were very much like normal human beings, as we all know. They were our parents. So normal enough. But I think what they went through, having been born around the time of World War I, gone through the Depression, gone through World War II, they had a really clear idea about how bad things could get. Really bad. People don't stop to think. 9/11, for example, has given everybody a lot of fear, I think, in our country about things falling apart. And yet, 9/11, that amount of destruction took place every single day from September 1939 until, September of 1945. And every day, more people died on average, because so many people died during that 6-year period. And we had a one-day experience and kind of lost our marbles a little bit about it. It was a terrible thing, obviously, but it didn't change the world the way they said the world will never be the same again. No, we humans are quite capable of making things the same again and then ruining them again. So it's. And I think when people say, oh, now the world is coming to an end now, I think it's extremely useful to go back to World War II. Imagine yourself in Berlin in end of 1944, or in Tokyo, end of 1944. Now, the war isn't over yet, but you kind of know you're going to lose, and destruction is raining all around you, and you probably are in despair and thinking, we will never, ever never will life be the same again. And yet, in 1960, in both Tokyo and Berlin, nobody would have imagined that middle-class life would be back, everything would be rebuilt in just 15, 16 years. Now, that's the power of a middle class that's willing to delay gratification to get something done, get their lives back. And we now have 300 million people in India like that, and a couple hundred million people in China like that. So I don't think we can gain any confidence that we won't go to war again. But I think we can gain confidence that our society has moved forward enough that very large portions of it will rebuild within 15 years after we make another mess out of things. So if you're looking for some optimism, that's my detailed form of optimism for this. Unfortunately, tonight, Norman Naimark, who was going to speak, is ill, and so he's not going to be able to speak about the Stalin approach. However, we are very lucky because we have Ian Morris speaking on Churchill and Roosevelt. He happens to know a lot about Stalin too. So he's added a segment about Stalin, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background too. So the other thing that I really wanted to say about this program is that this program was first conceived more than 20 years ago. It was going to be a 60th anniversary. And we tested, and of course it was back in the days when Humanities West had 2-day programs and everything. And the man who first conceived of this program is right over here, Kirk McKenzie, Judge Kirk McKenzie. And Kirk, how long were you on the board of directors of Humanities West? 20 years or something, right?
21 years.
21 years, yeah. So he has been retired from Humanities West for a while, but his program is now being done tonight. So we never quite quit on a program we like. So that's the background. So let me tell you a little bit about why Russia thinks the way they do about some big issues. This might not be completely accurate, but this is my approach to it. It's, the history of Russia, and if you say the Slavic world and the Teutonic Knights, is very similar to other groups in history, that things have gone on for a long time, and then there's a new iteration of the fight, like the British and the French. I mean, yes, they were kind of allies, as I say, kind of allies. It's what we're talking about tonight. It's a very strange alliance that we had in World War II. We had a common enemy. Everyone said, if the enemy of your enemy is your friend. So we made allies out of a communist empire and a colonial empire and a capitalist empire. And so people say that's a very strange alliance. And when we thought about how we could move the original idea for this program into a 2-hour slot, we thought, well, what we could focus on is, again, thinking of what it would be like at the end of 1944. The Allies knew they were going to win, most likely, and what did they then start doing? Well, Stalin started having his idea about what he was going to do to get what he wanted. Churchill started having his ideas of what he wanted to do to get what he wanted. And FDR started, so the Allies started to split apart. You could look at it as a missed opportunity, as I described it, with those three countries could have worked together, and but that's always asking too much. So the background on this is very similar to, for example, we always say that the Middle East is difficult because the Shias and the Sunnis, are at odds with each other. What a lot of people don't pay attention to is that the Shias and the Sunnis were a split in their religion, but it was put upon a split in politics between the Persians and the Arabs, which was a couple thousand years older than the whole Islamic religion. And when you add a religious divide onto a political divide, it's not that easy to, in 3 days, fix it. Just, I know that we thought we won that war in Iraq in 3 days, but the aftermath sort of showed that it wasn't exactly as big a success as was originally thought. So I think if we look at Stalin and his approach and what he was thinking about and what the Russians were thinking about, they were thinking, here come the Teutonic Knights again. They're taking over our country one more time. They're always coming in and fighting us. Not that, they kind of forget the times that they did in the other direction. That's something we all do. So his approach was, how are we going to protect the Soviet Union and this communist experiment, and even if he didn't believe in the communist experiment anyway, it was a Russian experiment. How are we going to keep that secure? So, because they were coming in and taking over all the lands, moving back into Germany, his idea was, let's have a buffer zone between our empire and those Teutonic Knights. I don't know if you've heard this comedian. I probably shouldn't imitate him, but I'm going to anyway. He said, it's Norm Macdonald from years ago, and they said, people say, I'm really worried about the Middle East. I'm really worried about the Saudi Arabians. I'm really worried about the North Koreans. I'm really worried. He said, I don't worry about any of these countries. I only worry about one country, and that's Germany. And he said, and the reason I worry about Germany, for those of you who aren't history buffs, is that they decided in 1914 to go to war. And who did they go to war against? The whole world. So then what happened? They almost won. Well, they lost. That's good. But then 20 years later, they decided to go to war again. And who did they decide to go to war again this time? The whole world again. And again, they almost won. He said, that's the country I'm worried about. So, obviously, the way that the post-World War II situation was managed, and probably one of the smarter looking ahead ideas in anybody's foreign policy was the American foreign policy. We were self-interested to try to keep the Soviets at bay. But even so, by bringing Germany back into the fold and helping them, create a democratic situation, and their culture was, sufficient for that, all those kind of things that don't always happen. We created a really stable country and a productive country that has been behaving itself. And they have also, been very clear about how terrible what they did was, in their history and teaching their children, all those things that nobody, or not nobody, but almost nobody does in order to prevent the future. So that's the background of what's going on, but still the Russians at the time of World War II didn't feel this way because that hadn't happened yet. And they had an alliance and didn't believe that the alliance would last. This is Stalin and Hitler, and they were right, it didn't last. So now Stalin is looking at that whole situation and saying, what can I do about this? And his, of course, answer was what most countries that have power do. I want a buffer zone between myself and that other country. Now, that eventually got called the Iron Curtain, and we all know how difficult that was for their economies, etc. So there are lots of outcomes. But that's at least partially what he was thinking. Like all of us, he probably had 1,000 motives for what he did, right? So we're not going to call it all the motives, like that one stuck in there about his mother not treating him right at this point. We don't have to worry about that. We talk about the big political motives that he had for what he did. But that approach is still being seen today because Putin also looks at the world pretty much the same way. Would like to have his buffer zone back, doesn't like not having the buffer zone. He also thinks that some people have maybe lied to them. Not that he didn't lie back, but that some people lied to him because the Russians had to be persuaded to let East Germany reunite with West Germany. And this is kind of against their whole history to allow that to happen. And they did it because they were promised that NATO would not expand past that. One of our great diplomats said, well, we didn't put it in writing. So there's some basis for him thinking other people are lying. Now, if you look at history and you look at your neighbors, you find that most people are lying all the time. So it's not too surprising to feel that way. But I think that this basis also should be seen in terms of how did Russia get started? If we go back to the start of Russia, which was right near the turn of the last millennium, 1000, it was a Viking prince that came down and set up in Kiev, and his name was Rus, and that's where Russia comes from. So Kiev was the origin place for the Russian nation. I won't go into any of the details now, but there's a reason why they feel that Kiev is important, and et cetera, and it hasn't been that way for a long time. But now just imagine if the United States split into, red America and blue America. And blue America took Washington, D.C., and red America, made their capital Kansas City or something. Eventually they would feel that Washington, D.C. was really part of their thing. I mean, it was part of the South before, maybe we should get it back. You can imagine that 200 or 300 years later. It's not too hard if people are, don't have enough to do and therefore want to have some excitement. So we should be able to understand, without saying, okay, you can have the Ukraine, but we should at least understand what the arguments are and treat them as responsible individuals in the negotiations, because that's the way you get the best out of any negotiation anyway, even if you have no reason to think that they're going to be irresponsible. It still works better to at least let them pretend that you think that they're responsible. Because it's just like with children, if you know that they're not going to be responsible, but if you pretend that you think that they're going to be responsible, more than half the time they'll be more responsible than they would have been otherwise. So it's kind of the same principle. And I think that's enough of an oversight. And now I'll give you our expert, Ian Morris, who is now going to tell you the points of view of Churchill and FDR, and then he's going to fill in something about Stalin too on the fly. Those of you who are old-time Humanities West people, everyone knows Ian because we've had him many, many times over the years. Welcome back, Ian.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, George, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to everybody for coming out this evening on the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, a momentous anniversary. San Francisco, as I'm sure you all know, San Francisco played a part in that 80th anniversary. The foundation of the United Nations opened here officially on October 24th, 1945. So it's a real honor to be invited here to share my thoughts about this with you. And I am by training an archaeologist and a historian. I teach at Stanford. I work on global history, and I like to look at the really, really long periods of history, going back tens of thousands of years, trying to identify what the big trends have been across all these millennia, and then talk a little bit about where they might go next, where the future is going to be heading. And I've written about a number of different things. My most recent book, which came out 3 years ago, was called Geography is Destiny, and that was about a 10,000-year-long history of the British Isles. And that got me actually very interested in the fella on the left there, Winston Churchill, who really did have an outsized impact on the 20th century Britain. So George asked me to come along and talk about the visions, initially of Churchill and Roosevelt, and mission creep has now extended this to Stalin as well. Talk about these, and then we decided I should do so in their own words, because I have a lot to say for myself, but what I say is not as interesting as what they said. So I'm going to try to weave together bits and pieces of things that they wrote and things that they said. Well, the Churchill and Roosevelt, the Stalin one, I kind of just made it up. But Churchill and Roosevelt weave together bits and pieces of what they said. And now, I did also think I would try to do the accents, and then my wife begged me not to try to do the accents, so I'm not, I promised her I wouldn't. I'm not going to try to do the accents. So you just got to imagine me looking a bit rounder, well, not Roosevelt isn't very round at all, a bit jowlier and even older than I actually am. Imagine a bow tie. I don't actually possess a bow tie. I would have worn one otherwise. Sometimes think I own the last necktie in California as well. But anyway, imagine me looking a bit more like these guys. Now, I should say I'm going to play a little bit fast and loose with the chronology as well, because there are certain awkward things for this 80th anniversary here, like the fact that Roosevelt was dead before the anniversary, actually, before we got to the end of the Second World War, and the fact that Churchill had already been fired before we get to September of 1945. So I'm going to be mixing together statements mostly from during the Second World War and shortly afterwards. But, of course, what is a few months and a dead president among friends? I'm sure you will forgive me for doing all this. So I ask you now to join me for a little bit of necromancy as I summon up from the grave the spirits of these three giant figures, starting over on your far left with Winston Churchill. And picture the scene then. So Winston Churchill sitting in a big armchair, he's got his cigar going, and he's sort of musing to himself, writing in his diary his innermost thoughts at some vaguely defined point after the end of the Second World War. So Churchill takes over. So, the black dog has been back. I've been depressed, I can't concentrate, I can't sleep, I can't even paint. I can still drink, but I can't do any of the things I care about. I'm worried about what have I really achieved? I've fulfilled every goal I had for my life, but what have I really achieved? Just a few years ago, I told a crowd at Mansion House, I have not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. But that clearly is what I have done. Things had seemed so clear just a few years ago. When I became the Prime Minister in 1940, darkest hour in modern British history, things had seemed so clear. They asked me in the House of Commons, what is our policy? And I could say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival. Let that be realized. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it was subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guided by the British fleet, would carry on in the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and liberation of the old. That was always the policy, even if I couldn't always say so. Always the policy to bring the Americans into the war. Because even with all the resources of the empire behind us, with Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, all fighting in our army, our navy, our air force, we could never overmaster a Germany commanding so much of the productive power and manpower of Europe. The money was already running out in Britain in 1940. So we needed the Americans, just as we had done in 1916 when the money ran out in the First World War. Or, to be more precise, we needed one American, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If we had him, we had everything we needed. No lover ever studied every whim of his mistress as I did those of President Roosevelt. The letters I wrote him, the untruths I whispered. Never let it be said that I was unwilling to sell any part of myself to achieve my goal. And Roosevelt persuaded the Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Agreement, the most unsordid act in the history of any nation. Not that he gave me anything he didn't have to give. He drove a hard bargain. He counted his money carefully. When he heard in 1941 that we had $24 million in South African gold that had been squirreled away to support the British war effort, he sent warships to London to take it all away. I wrote him a letter. I told him, you are acting like a sheriff, collecting the last assets of a helpless debtor. I put it in his envelope. I was ready to send it, and then I didn't send it. Wiser counsel prevailed. That was probably not a good plan. And the first time our staffs met in London to talk about the prosecution of the war effort, we and they jointly pledged to continue the struggle against Herr Hitler to the utmost of our respective capacities. But that apparently didn't actually include fighting for the Americans. So I didn't get everything that I wanted. But you can always rely on the American people to do the right thing once they've exhausted the alternatives. And they realized the alternatives had been exhausted. These are Churchill's words, by the way, I'm telling you. They realized they had exhausted the alternatives on December the 7th, 1941. A day of infamy, as Roosevelt famously and rightly called it. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, I was fast asleep. My butler came in and woke me and told me the news. Now, at this very moment, I knew that the United States was in the war, up to the neck and into the death. So we had won after all. And then Herr Hitler did my work for me and declared war on the United States. My great fear was that the American people, in their righteous anger, would focus on Japan and make the Pacific the top priority, worry about being attacked from the Pacific. But Hitler did the job for me, got rid of all Roosevelt's worries about whether he could persuade Congress to actually declare war on the Germans. Saturated and satiated with emotion and sensation, I went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the saved. Well, Roosevelt was the greatest American friend that Britain has ever found. Talking to him was like uncorking your first bottle of champagne. And this is something I know about, a lot of experience. Everything turned out just as I said. And that was where it all went wrong. When Herr Hitler finally did the right thing and ended his life, I was able to say to my dear friends, the British people, this is your hour. This is not a victory of a party or of any class. It's a victory of the great British nation as a whole. But then I discovered that they actually were not my dear friends. They turned me out of office 2 months later. Now, the polls, admittedly, the opinion polls since 1943 had been predicting a Labour landslide in the election. But I never took that very seriously. I mean, really, what are these people thinking? Who has just saved them from the worst fate in the world? I have. What are these people thinking? I warned them. I gave a radio broadcast shortly before the election. I told them there can be no doubt that socialism is inseparably interwoven with totalitarianism and the abject worship of the state. Liberty in all its forms is challenged by the fundamental concepts of socialism. There can be no doubt that socialism, oh, I already said that, and where would the simple ordinary folk, the common people, as they like to call them in America, where would they be once this mighty organism of the socialist state had got them in its grip? Many of those who are advocating socialism or voting socialist today will be horrified at this claim. But that is because they are short-sighted. That is because they do not see where their theories are leading them. This is what I told the voters, and then they voted against me. What were they thinking? Now, some even said that that speech cost me the election. Certainly, the world has not turned out as I had hoped it would when we were putting together our grand alliance. In some ways, there's been more blood, toil, tears and sweat after 1945 than we had before. Britain started to ration bread in 1946. They'd never rationed bread during the war. 1946, bread rationing comes in. Clothes rationing came in 1949. There had never been clothes rationing during the war. After the war, it came in. Meat rationing had begun during the war. It continued till 1954. 9 years after Hitler was defeated, the British are still rationed with how much meat they can eat each day. And then on the larger stage, bad to worse, India was lost in 1947. Palestine was lost in 1948. Egypt, I won't even talk about what happened in Egypt because it's so embarrassing. The world has been divided against us in ways I did not foresee. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line, all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high, and in many cases increasing, measure of control from Moscow. So, I've been thinking. In the darkest hour, in our finest hour, I asked, what is our policy? And I answered, victory. Now, after the war, when I ask, what then is the overall strategic concept which we should inscribe today? I have to answer, it is nothing less than the safety and welfare, the freedom and progress of all the homes and families of all the men and women in all the lands. Neither the sure prevention of war nor the continuous rise of world organization will be gained without what I have called the fraternal association of the English-speaking peoples. This means a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States. And how do we get that? We woo American presidents, as I wooed President Roosevelt. But we carry a big stick too. We build hydrogen bombs. We must do it. It's the price we pay to sit at the top table. And I, Winston Churchill, never had the slightest doubt that we must, whatever it costs, we must have thermonuclear weapons at the earliest possible opportunity. Now, my scientists told me very early on that all of the bombs we could conceivably build could only kill about 8 million Russians. And being Winston Churchill, that number does not faze me in the least. However, what upsets me about the number 8 million Russians is that it is so much less than 20 million Russians, which is how many the Germans killed. And if that didn't stop Stalin, then us killing 8 million Russians is surely not going to deter Stalin. But bullying Stalin is actually not the point of having nuclear weapons. It's to bully the Americans. This is why we have to have the bomb in Britain. Not because we are going to go to war with the United States and start firing, well, we didn't have missiles, dropping hydrogen bombs on New York City. Of course we're not going to do that. The way we were thinking about the nuclear deterrent was put best by a secret report published long after I'm out of office, but one how somehow magically I am able to foresee what this secret report is going to say. And it said, by threatening to use our independent nuclear power against the Soviet Union, we can secure United States cooperation in situations in which their interests were less immediately threatened than our own. The tail will wag the dog. This is British grand strategy after the Second World War. The British tail will wag the American dog because that's the only way we can survive in this world. But that is only part of it, the hard nuclear power. That is only a part of what needs to be done. As I look out upon the future of our country, in the changing scene of human destiny, I feel the existence of three great circles among free nations and democracies. I almost wish I had a blackboard. Now, I almost wish I had PowerPoint, but he didn't know about PowerPoint, so I can't have any PowerPoint. So you, like Churchill's audience in 1948, you just have to imagine this. He said, I would make a picture for you. The first of the three circles for us is naturally the British Commonwealth and Empire, with all that comprises. Then there is also the English-speaking world, in which we, Canada, and the other British dominions and United States play so important a part. And finally, there is United Europe. These three majestic circles are coexistent, and if they are linked together, there is no force or combination which could overthrow them or even challenge them. Now, if you think of the three interlinked circles, you'll see that we, Britain, we are the only country which has a great part in every one of them. We stand, in fact, at the very point of junction. And here in this island, at the centre of the seaways and perhaps of the airways also, have the opportunity of joining them all together. If we rise to the occasion, in the years that are to come, it may be found that once again we hold the key to opening a safe and happy future to humanity, which will gain for ourselves gratitude and fame. And that's where Churchill's diary breaks off. He left it at that point. This is his vision of the world we have now entered. Now, okay, at this point, the scene changes. Okay, we do the Twilight Zone thing, and we change the scene. And now we are sitting with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, although clearly he has been dead for several years by the point we just got to it. Never mind. Somehow he is not only not dead, he has also gotten hold of Churchill's diary. Okay, so he's just read what you just heard. And now he's sitting down for a martini, which was his drink of choice, my drink of choice too, in case any of you wonder. My drink of choice too, except he patented his own favourite martini recipe, which was gin and then a little bit of brine, salt water with a twist of lemon, which I tried this. It's disgusting. I don't know how the man drank it. And the salt water thing is not bad, and the twist of lemon, of course, is perfectly normal. Together, they are terrible. But this is a tradition, as many of you I'm sure will know. American presidents, a lot of them have their own personal martini recipes. Richard Nixon, he had the best one, which was wonderful. And his recipe was, you take some olives and you put them in a bowl of vermouth and you let them stand overnight. And then the next, well, not morning, hopefully, but at whatever point in the day Nixon started, maybe it was morning, started in on his martinis, you take the olives out of the vermouth and you put them in a glass of gin and you just drink it. That is a fabulous recipe. But so anyway, back to the story. FDR is sitting down for a martini for a fireside chat with his advisor, Harry Hopkins, who is also long dead. He actually was dead within a year of Roosevelt dying. He's sitting down for a fireside chat with Harry Hopkins and several other friends, and they've all got their martinis. And FDR is sort of waxing nostalgic and like Churchill, but a bit more positively. He's thinking about, well, what have I done? What sort of world have I helped to create with the struggles of the last few years? So he's got the diary and he's been reading these passages out of Churchill's diary to his friends. And he says, well, What nonsense, Harry. Winston was a hopeless romantic. He was imperialist, he was unrealistic, and he was a drunk. He was drunk much of the time. It was like the man never knew what he was fighting for, only what he was fighting against. He was fighting against fascism, and yet, good for him, we all agree on that. Fighting against fascism, but he was also fighting against the end of the British Empire. Not really for a vision, but against what he feared and rightly saw was coming, what everybody knew was coming, what even his own Conservative Party in the 1930s knew was coming. He was fighting desperately against that. But there was never any vision of a new world order, to come out of this great struggle. He talked a number of times to me about what he called an Anglo-American condominium to police the world. Just ridiculous. I mean, nothing like that was conceivably going to happen. And I admit, I did myself talk about sometimes the four policemen of the world: the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. But that was more in a figurative kind of sense. Do you know, he even suggested, long before the war was over, that we merge our two countries. We make Britain and the United States a single country. So because of our familial closeness, we could have some form of common citizenship. Good grief, what was the man thinking? He never took what I said about changing the world seriously. He always seemed to think this was politics, that I have an undeserved reputation, frankly, for always telling everybody what they want to hear. And he thought this is what I was doing in all of my political speeches. He never took the underlying message seriously. Even when we met back in 1941 at Placentia Bay, that led to the signing of the Atlantic Charter, he didn't seem to think that our joint proclamation actually meant anything. Seemed to think it was just for show, that we would fight this war and it was going to be sort of like the last one. We said in the Charter, we said we respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and that we wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. How did he think that was consistent with the British Empire? Baffles me. Or the bit about furthering the enjoyment by all states, great or small, to the trade and raw materials of the world. How did that fit with the British Empire? He still thinks Queen Victoria's on the throne. He thinks he's Lord Palmerston, who's going to call up the gunboats every time there's any trouble, and that is the way the world should work. The first chance he gets, as we beginning to see the end of the war, the first chance he gets, he sends this thing, you know what he called it? He called it his naughty note. He sends the naughty notes to Stalin, suggesting to them, why don't we, the British and the Soviets, carve up the Balkans into spheres of influence, like we would have done in the 19th century, like Britain and Russia did do in the 19th century. Who even talks that way anymore? This is not a world for spheres of influence. The minute he can, he's flying out to Athens in 1944 to have secret talks to anoint one set of Greeks over another set of Greeks in a new government that he's going to set up that is going to be a puppet of the British Empire. He did not understand. It's over. That world has gone forever. But the one thing you could say about Winston, at the end of the day, he always gets real. He understands power. He does as he's told, because what else are the Brits going to do? They do as they're told. Uncle Joe, my friend Uncle Joe Stalin, he's more of an issue. You know that idiot Chip Bolan, who used to work for me. Bolan, do you know what Bolan said about me after the Yalta conference? He said that I thought that Stalin viewed the world somewhat in the same light as I did, and that Stalin's hostility and distrust, which were evident in all the wartime conferences, they were due to the neglect that Soviet Russia had suffered at the hands of other countries for years after the revolution. What I did not understand, Bolan claimed, was that Russia's enmity was based on profound ideological convictions. Well, what a fool. I always thought he was the one who was soft on Russia. He seemed to think I was the one who was soft on Russia. He seemed to think I let Stalin run rings around me. He seemed to think that I was so determined to show Stalin who had the upper hand out of me and Churchill that I was willing to back the Russians against the British. What nonsense. And yet, everybody does seem to think that that was what I did. And maybe he does sort of have something. I mean, it's hard to be hard on the Russians after all they've suffered. I know I said a lot of bad things about the Soviet Union before the war, but after all they've suffered, you do sort of have to give them a break. I did kind of think that if I just give Joe Stalin everything that I possibly can and ask nothing from him in return, then noblesse oblige. He won't try to annex anything after the war, and he'll work for a world of democracy and peace. I admit I did sort of think that. And now I am beginning to drift toward what Averell Harriman keeps saying to me. We can't do business with Stalin. He's broken every one of the promises he made at Yalta. But again, he understands power when he sees it. He knows that the Soviets have the biggest army in the world, the biggest of pretty much everything, but they can't possibly defeat us. He understands this clearly. He knows that if we need to, we can remake the world without the Soviet Union. So, yeah, I can handle Joe Stalin. No, you know who is the real problem, the real fly in the post-war ointment. In the State of the Union last year, I called them a noisy minority who maintain an uproar of demands for special favors for special groups, pests who swarm through the lobbies of the Congress and the cocktail bars of Washington, representing these special groups as opposed to the basic interests of the nation as a whole. That's what I called them, but we all knew who I meant, the Republicans. That is who is the real problem in the world. Now, these suspicious souls, using a polite terminology, they're fearful that I have made commitments, they put it in quotation marks, commitments for the future, which might pledge this nation to enacting the role of Santa Claus. Now, nonsense. The one supreme objective for the future, which we discussed in Tehran and Yalta for every nation individually and for all the United Nations, can be summed up in one word: security. And that means not only physical security, which provides safety from attacks by aggressors. It means also economic security, social security, moral security in a family of nations. The best interests of each nation, large and small, demand that all freedom-loving nations shall join together in a just and durable system of peace, with a decent standard of living for all individual men and women and children in all nations. Freedom from fear is eternally linked with freedom from want. Now, there are people who burrow through our nation, attempting to spread the suspicion that if other nations are encouraged to raise their standards of living, our own American standard of living must of necessity be depressed. The fact is the very contrary. It has been shown time and again that if the standard of living of any country goes up, so does its purchasing power, and that such a rise encourages a better standard of living in neighboring countries with whom it trades. That is just plain common sense. America's own rightful place in the world depends in large part upon how fully these principles have been carried out into practice for our citizens. For unless there is security here at home, there cannot be lasting peace in the world. Now, one of the great American industrialists of our day, a man who has rendered yeoman service to his country in this crisis, I don't actually know who he meant by this, maybe one of you does, but one great American of our day recently emphasized the grave dangers of what he called a rightist reaction in this nation. If such a reaction should develop, then it is certain that we shall have yielded to the spirit of fascism here at home. Oh, am I boring you? Well, I know you've heard all this before in my State of the Union address recently, but it was one of my better ones. You know, people are calling it a second Bill of Rights. Well, yes, I know, I did suggest that name myself, but they liked it. They are calling it a second Bill of Rights. Why can't everyone just see that freedom at home and working with other nations abroad are two sides of the same coin? We have to learn that we cannot live alone at peace, that our own well-being is dependent on the well-being of other nations far away. We've learned to be citizens of the world. We've learned that we must live as men, not as ostriches. So let us say to democracies, we Americans are vitally concerned in your defense of freedom. We are putting forth our energies, our resources, and our organizing powers to give you the strength to regain and maintain a free world. We shall send you in ever-increasing numbers ships, planes, tanks, guns. This is our purpose and our pledge. It's un-American to turn our backs on democracies attacked by tyrants. Now, you know, I've not been feeling well. I'm sitting here with my little blankie wrapped around me. I've not been feeling well. But if I live long enough to see a real United Nations convened, what I'll say to them is that man has learned long ago that it is impossible to live unto himself. This same basic principle applies today to all nations. We were not isolated during the war. We dare not now become isolated in peace. All will concede that in order to have good neighbors, we must also be good neighbors. So, how about we call everybody together in San Francisco? Can't think of a better place for showing that America opens its arms to everyone. Well, maybe not quite everyone. Not the Japanese, we lock them up. And I'm not so keen on having more Jews here either, although I perhaps shouldn't say that given the circumstances at the moment. But we open our arms, sort of, to everyone. You know, I'd better live long enough for this. I don't think that haberdasher Truman is going to be able to handle the job at all. Okay, we are now beamed away to Stalin's Dasha, a few miles outside Moscow, where he is sitting there with copious quantities of vodka and all of his Politburo cronies. So, says Stalin, whew, glad that's over. That Hitler, he was bad news right from the beginning. I had to trust him, I had to try to make friends with him, but I don't know, there was something about that man that really put me off. And then he almost brought me down. When he invaded the Soviet Union, everybody had told me he was about to do it. Churchill sent me a series of personal messages in the week leading up to June the 22nd, 1941, telling me the British knew that Hitler had massed the largest army ever seen along the borders of the Soviet Union. But I couldn't afford to believe it. If it was true, everything was over, because I had just executed most of my officers for not being correctly Soviet. This could not be true. And then it turned out it was. I retreated to my Dasha. Some people say I had a nervous breakdown. I think that is slightly overstating it. But yes, I will admit that when Molotov and some of the other Politburo members came to find me a couple of weeks into the German invasion, I was sitting with a chair facing the wall, and I had been there for several hours. But it was not a nervous breakdown. When they came in, I was certain they had come to shoot me. They brought their revolvers, they were going to shoot me. So they took me rather by surprise when they said, Comrade Stalin, we need you to come back to Moscow and take over things. We're falling to pieces. Well, that was, you see, this was not what was supposed to happen. Everybody knew, this had been foretold in the writings of Marx and Lenin, there would be a great war of the fascists against the imperialists, because their interests collide so directly. The forces of production make that undeniable. They have to go to war with each other. And this didn't happen. The fascists turned on me. Now, I then found myself having to be friends with Winston Churchill, chief global anti-communist and warmonger, the most detestable man who ever walked the face of the earth. And there he is, trying to build bridges with me, and I'm trying to build them with him. And what does he say? He stands up and he tells the House of Commons, if Herr Hitler were to invade hell, I would find a few good words to say about Beelzebub. That's supposed to make me feel good about this? But this was, you take your allies where you find them. And a remarkable thing happened. Once I struck up formal alliances with the British and the Americans, they started giving me stuff. And not a little bit of stuff either, lots of stuff. And the more I complained about wanting better stuff, the more they gave me. And it just went on and on and on. 3/4 of the trucks in the Red Army were made in Michigan. Extraordinary thing. What exactly were they thinking? How was I supposed to take them seriously if they were this stupid? But they were. Now, I still think the British are the worst. We see the great wealth and power of the United States. But right here at the end of the war, the British are the ones I'm actually most worried about, which makes it also puzzling. At the conferences, Churchill was constantly groveling at the feet of Roosevelt, begging him to work with him. And Roosevelt, I just never figured that man out. I've got to think he went senile toward the end. And the man was a complete fool. Everyone around him could see that I was lying. He seemed to think that we were friends. Inexplicable development on his part. But the question now, what now? Roosevelt is dead. This strange little hat merchant Truman has taken over the job. The British in their wisdom have got rid of Winston Churchill. They voted in a socialist who appears not to know that he's a socialist. But the world has changed very dramatically. So what now? Well, we all know what the answer should be, because again, it is written in the pages of Marx and Lenin and Engels. What should now follow is world revolution. I should commit the Soviet Union to fomenting revolution all over the world. I am a dedicated socialist. I care only about the well-being of the working man all over the planet. And, well, yeah, sure I do, yeah. So I'm not going to do that, all right? We tried that a little bit in the past. This really went extremely badly. We are not going to commit ourselves to world revolution. We'll talk about it a lot, but we're not going to go for world revolution. Now, what we are going to have, we're going to have lots of spies. Working people in other countries seem to have concluded for some reason that communism is actually not a very good thing. But lots of intellectuals have decided that communism is an outstanding thing. In fact, pretty much everybody at Oxford and Cambridge universities thinks communism is a fabulous thing. And actually, if I can just step out of Stalin character for a little while. When I began my PhD in archaeology at Cambridge University in England in 1983, I was earnestly warned by one of the faculty there, nobody is ever going to ask you if you're a Marxist. They're going to ask what kind of Marxist you are. And this is very important because the Trotskyites, had this reputation for never buying a round of beer in the pub. And then this other group, the Althusserians, who are like French-inspired Marxists. So nobody could understand anything that they were saying. But the grip the Soviet Union had on the British and to some extent American intellectuals was quite extraordinary. But, Stalin says, I have all these intellectuals, these useful fools, we like to call them, who will do our bidding. But nobody else really seems to want to help us. So, Plan A, world revolution, that seems to be off the table. Plan B, which was actually approved by Lenin, socialism in one state. If we cannot have world revolution, we will build a socialist utopia within the Soviet Union, and our shining example will win the rest of the world over to our way of life. Well, it turned out that socialism in one state kind of stinks, and it didn't win anybody over to anything, and it led to an enormous proportion of our population in gulags. Socialism in one state is sort of difficult. Really, I think I should be thinking about what we're doing here less as a Soviet, as a communist, as a Marxist, and more just as a Russian. Even though I'm not actually Russian, I'm kind of Georgian, but we don't talk about that, and I persecute the Georgians. I'm going to think about it as a Russian, what we should be doing after the war. I'm going to think about it the way that Peter the Great thought about the geostrategic position of Russia. What Peter the Great realized was that during the generation or two before his lifetime, in the early 18th century, during the previous couple of generations, the geopolitical position of Russia had changed profoundly. For centuries, Russians worried about threats from the east. Russia is created out of resistance to the Mongols, who are carved out this great Mongol empire stretching all the way from China into Europe. Russia's identity was forged in the struggle with the Mongols. But then that all began to change. In 1608, the Poles and Lithuanians take Moscow, burn the city. In 1709, the Swedes invade from the west, march all the way down into Ukraine before Peter is able to defeat them. In 1812, Napoleon is back, marches all the way into Russia, burns Moscow again. In 1917, the Germans come very close to doing that. If we hadn't surrendered first, they would have done that. In 1941, they try it again. In 1942, they do it again. Now, are you all seeing the picture here? The threats come from the West. This is what we have to worry and think about, our Western frontiers. Our strategy should not be a Soviet strategy, it should be a Russian strategy. The strategy of the Tsars has now become the strategy of the party secretaries, and heaven, actually we don't believe in heaven, the revolution forbid it. If it should ever happen that communism ends in Russia, and we go to having some sort of president or something like that, they too should think in exactly the same way as I think, and exactly the same way that Peter the Great thinks. We should do everything in our power to push our Western frontiers as far into Europe as they can possibly go, to give us more space, more defense in depth for when the American imperialists strike against Mother Russia, as they will. There is no doubt about that. They will do this. So we have to, in spite of all the silly promises we gave to Roosevelt and Truman and Churchill and Attlee, we have to install communist puppet regimes in Poland, Czechoslovakia, all over the Balkans, Hungary, Germany, looking pretty promising. We've actually got an army all the way out to the River Elbe. Italy, looking really good. Greece, even better. There's a civil war about to break out in Greece. The communists are the only people who have guns. This is going to go fabulously. This is what we need to do. And once we install these governments, something else that Churchill and Roosevelt just don't seem to understand. We rule by fear. We rule by terror. We will never have any serious trouble within our satellite states if we just treat them cruelly enough. And then one last thing we need. We need the bomb. The world after the war is going to be about the bomb. First, second, third, and last, nuclear weapons are what everything is about. We must have the bomb. Now, Mother Russia produces some of the finest scientists in the world, but they are never actually going to get themselves organized to invent a bomb. But we can steal one. We've worked a lot already on that. I am very confident that within the next few months, we're going to have pretty much the entire blueprints of the American nuclear program. And then we'll build our own. At first, we'll only be able to afford to build one, and we'll test that. But we'll make it look like we've got lots and lots of bombs. And the bomb we test won't actually be an atomic weapon. It'll sort of be more like a dirty bomb, combines a little bit of an atomic weapon with a gigantic conventional charge. But it will look like an atomic weapon has gone off. And then we'll build 4 or 5 or 6 of these things, and we'll line up lots of bombers that look like they can carry more. And American politicians are so dysfunctional that they will persuade each other that we have a gigantic nuclear arsenal when we don't. And then they won't dare to touch us. We will have the bomb. Eventually, we will have a lot of bombs. They won't use theirs, but I will. So, thank you for listening to Joseph Stalin's thought on the shape of a post-war world. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So that's the first part about what the leaders were thinking. Now, what did somebody go through in actual World War II experience? So, Bill Hammond is going to talk about walking in a father's footsteps. So, Bill, go ahead.
Thanks. So on May 7th, 1945, the day of Germany's unconditional surrender to the Allies in World War II, a conscripted Polish farmer in a little crossroads village in Germany approached a mess sergeant from the 142nd Regiment, Company K. The newly freed conscript heard that the mess sergeant was from Chicago and was hoping that he would know a little Polish. He had a favor to ask. He had a son that was born 7 months earlier, and he wanted to get the kid baptized. The mess sergeant didn't have an immediate solution, but he said, let's go check with the old man. The old man was 30 years old. He was company commander. He was a first lieutenant. And by fate, training, and unfortunate attrition, he was in charge of the company. On hearing about the Polish family's dilemma and feeling jubilant about the end of the war in Europe, the company commander requisitioned 3 jeeps and headed with the family to a church that he had seen 60 miles south in Hochspeyer, Germany. Oh, and he said, I will volunteer to be the boy's godfather. The old man, our old man, like many World War II soldiers, didn't talk much about his time as a soldier. And I understand his reluctance. Who wants to revisit the most harrowing moments of our lives? But my dad on occasion did tell this story about the Polish boy. Perhaps as a diversion from the disaster and starvation that he'd witnessed, and perhaps also to grasp at a glimmer of hope. So for years, my siblings talked about honoring and thanking my father by taking a trip to follow his World War II footsteps. It was a pivotal time in his life, but one that we knew very little about. And so 2 brothers and I, Gene in the middle, number 1 of 12, George on the right, number 4 of 12, and I'm on the left, number 9 of 12. I often talk about us being the 3 squares of the family. Decided to make an excursion in October of 2023 with as much information as we had to try to trace his steps. And today, I'm just going to talk about some of the serendipitous moments from our journey and what we discovered about our father. Does anybody have anybody connected to World War II? Family member? Yeah, just about everybody. And one of the reasons for giving this talk is just to think about maybe you could conceive of a similar trip, either to honor somebody from World War II or somebody that you just care about as a way of remembering and recognizing what it is that they did. So I'd like to explain a little bit about the technique and the planning that we did for this trip. My dad finished his training in Northern Africa, in Oran, Algeria, and then they came up through Italy into the south of France. From France, went into Germany, down into Austria, and in the end went to Camp Lucky Strike in Dieppe to be released and sent back to the United States. So the trip that we took, we started in Italy, actually. We had tried to get to Northern Africa. The State Department recommended that we not go there. So we went and started in Italy. We found that the Texas Military Museum knew exactly where the 142nd Regiment had gone. And so that was our first piece of information. But then we found out that the 142nd Regiment had gone in stages, and we didn't know which wave my dad was in. So we needed to find a little bit more information. And then my sister Ruth found a trove of letters that my dad had written to his mother during the war. And some of the information in there was incredibly helpful, like this one, letter number 6. March 19th, 1944. Vesuvius was acting up last night, and we could see it for many miles. It looked like a huge bonfire on the top of the mountain. So what we were able to do is look back and find out when Vesuvius erupted, from the 12th to the 21st of March, 1944. This letter was on the 19th, so that kind of placed him in a very specific place and let us know which wave of the 142nd he was in. He also received 2 silver stars and 2 Purple Hearts, and there are citations for those, and so we had that information as well. However, we knew that we had imperfect, imprecise information, and we had to improvise. In the end, we relied fairly heavily on serendipity. So we flew to Naples, and it amazed me that Naples, when you look out into the water, looked very much like our hometown, Kenosha, Wisconsin, looking out onto Lake Michigan. Looking that way, you could just see a broad expanse of water and piers that were similar. Looking the other way were mountains, very different from Kenosha. So we started at Salerno Beach, where he came in. There was no fighting at that point, and they just started moving north into Italy. We knew that he'd been in Avellino, Italy, because we have a photograph of him, and on the back of the picture it says Avellino, Italy. And so we thought maybe we'll start just by looking for the photography studio that took this picture. When we got there, the photography studio was no longer in business, but we saw a lot of people that we thought we could talk to and get some information from. My dad, our dad, got into Avellino after the big part of the war that Avellino dealt with. 1 out of 8 residents of Avellino were killed in that part of the war. If you think about it in terms of San Francisco, it'd be a little more than 100,000 people were killed in that part of the war. It wasn't that many people because Avellino was smaller than San Francisco, but it was a lot. And at the same time, my dad would be writing letters, and he would say they hadn't been dealing with any fighting yet, but they saw people coming back. And though, in his own words, he said, "I have not been baptized yet in war," we could see what kind of impact it was having on people. And this is what he talks about. The Germans really use the scorched earth policy, and we don't do a bad job ourselves of destroying buildings, etc. Where the Jerry gets firmly entrenched, Jerry meaning German at the time, where the Jerry gets firmly entrenched, thank God that the war never reached the US. It's a mess and leaves people in such a helpless condition. We see and hear plenty, but that will have to wait. Read the papers, but realize that it is written for the consumption of the public. War is not as glamorous as they'd have you believe, and it is not as widespread as it indicates. Fighting a war is a science, and science develops slowly. So a man is not always dodging shells, even though he's on the front lines. Life goes on merrily a few blocks away. From Avellino, and the memorial to all the soldiers and the people who died, we went through Cassino, Italy, because we knew about the Battle of Monte Cassino. We knew from when my dad arrived that he was not in the big battle, and the big battle of Monte Cassino, half of the American soldiers were killed. And they stayed there for another month so that they could get replacement troops. But when I gave this talk in Kenosha, Wisconsin, somebody from Kentucky saw online that I'd given this talk, and he said, "Oh, your dad was in Cassino, Italy," because I have a photograph of him. So he sent, it was pretty amazing. He sent a photograph to confirm that my dad had gone through Cassino, so even though we didn't know it at the time that we were taking this trip, we got some verification that way. And now he's starting to deal with the battles. June 28th, 1944, somewhere in Italy. Many times a German-occupied house will be included in our objective, and while they kill the chicken, pick it, and fry it, we arrive so soon that we eat it. They had to take off in such a hurry, they just leave the table set, and we move right in and enjoy it. They aren't bad cooks either. I've had some of their coffee they had brewing and had to wait for it to cool off. So, all of war is not too bad. There are compensations, but the big one will be when it quits and we can get back to somewhat of a normal life again. There will be many scars from this war. On human mentality, I mean. The physical disabilities are bad enough, but a person has to be rough and tough, both physically and mentally, to withstand the things he has to do and things he sees, or he'd miss the boat entirely. The Americans here are doing it, and well, with few exceptions. I wouldn't say all are brave. Anybody who isn't scared is a fool. But we are all well trained and have confidence in our weapons, in ourselves, and in our pals to fight well. So a person sees very little outward fear, even when things get very tough. Everybody continues to do their job with an inconceivable calmness. I guess everybody figures that God will see to it that we'll get it if it's our turn, and if it isn't, we'll just have to carry on as best we can. That's the picture that was sent to me by the person from Kentucky. And it's of the officers of Company K. So from Italy, yeah, for those of you who you can watch the map there. For the people in the front row, you can just follow the tie. The tie gives you the same. So you go through Italy, and then he landed at San Rafael Beach in France. And that was our next goal. Our goal in France was actually, once we got to San Rafael Beach and worked our way up, the place of his first silver star was in France in a national forest somewhere. And that's all the information we had. So we were going to try to find this place where he earned his first silver star. And this is what the citation said. So he lands on August 15th, November 9th and 10th of 1944 in France. While returning to friendly lines, a combat patrol consisting of 2 platoons was fired on by 5 enemy machine guns, and the leader was wounded. Lieutenant Hammond assumed command and led an attack on the enemy positions. He destroyed a machine gun emplacement, a machine pistol emplacement with 2 hand grenades. Efforts to penetrate the German lines failed, darkness fell, and because the supply of ammunition was low, the situation was critical. Lieutenant Hammond then led the group over 2,000 yards of rugged terrain through a blinding snowstorm to the shelter of a farmhouse from which contact was made with friendly forces. By his courage and outstanding leadership, Lieutenant Hammond successfully destroyed hostile machine gun emplacement and led a large patrol safely back from behind enemy lines. That was the information we had. So how are we going to find it? Rugged terrain, farmhouse, that's not a lot of information. So we thought we'd let Google help us a little bit. So we're driving north. To this national forest, and we get to a rotary. And on the rotary, there are 4 exits. So we take the first exit, thinking it's the correct one, and when we get just about 100 yards away, Google says, you're going in the wrong direction. We come back to the rotary, and we take the second exit. And about 100 yards into that, Google says, you're going in the wrong direction. Take the third exit and the fourth exit, and Google says the same thing each time. No matter which exit we took, it was the wrong exit. So we're trying to figure out, now what do we do? So we went around the rotary again, and we noticed off the second exit, there was a little alleyway to the right, barely wide enough to fit one car through. We go up that alleyway. Google is happy. We decide to keep going up. Small roads, 2 cars could not pass on this. Google is still happy. And we get up to the main road into the national forest. A lane and a half. Google says you're going in the right direction. So we said, let's just keep going. So we keep going on this road for a couple of miles, and we don't see a single car, and we don't see a single house. And we think, there's no way that we're going to be able to find a farmhouse. There's no way we're going to be able to find something with this rugged terrain. And as we get over a hill, there's one farmhouse. This is in the national forest. We look to the left, rugged terrain. We tried to find the farmers here. There was nobody home, but it was still a working farm. There were turkeys, there were ducks, there were chickens in the yard. We're not certain this is the farmhouse, but there was nothing else to see along this whole trip. So we decided to take a little hike up the rugged terrain, read the citation on the hill, and then decided to move on. By the way, I told you about the letters from Italy. There were letters from Italy, there were letters from Germany. There were never any letters from France that we could find. And we were trying to figure out why. And we think, we think it might have been that that's when the most hostile of the fighting happened, that he may not have had as much time to write. So the second Silver Star, which is called an oak leaf cluster, happened a few months later. So this was November 9th and 10th. In March of 1945, March 20th of 1945, the moment of his second Silver Star, the oak leaf cluster, went something like this. As the men of Company K neared the crest of a hill, they were subjected to intense machine gun and rifle fire from trenches and pillboxes 25 yards away. You think of a football field, you think of 25 yards away, you are in a bad position. Lieutenant Hammond, company commander, immediately exposed himself to the hostile fire to direct his men in clearing the enemy positions. During the fierce fight which ensued, he was painfully wounded by a fragment of a hand grenade. Refusing medical aid, he courageously moved among his men, encouraging them and directing their fire until the hill was taken. Although suffering from concussion, he determinedly supervised the defensive deployment of his men. As a result of the courage and leadership of Lieutenant Hammond, the company seized and held the objective. So we went to Kaiserslautern, read this there, and then read this letter, which he wrote the next day to his sister. This is 3/21/45, March 21st, 1945. He says, somewhere in Germany. Of course, they couldn't identify exactly where they were in Italy or Germany because they didn't want to give away their positions. He writes to his sister, constant faith in God, patience, and continued hope that this will soon be over will make us all appreciative of God's favors. I know that my sister will never despair and that life will be good for you. I know that all the boys, when they come home, will have profited by their experiences, and family life will be more precious than ever before. Happy birthday, sis. We figured since we were in Germany, and having heard the story about this baptismal situation, that we would go and try to find that as well. And so after getting to the place of the second silver star, we wanted to find the church where this happened. We knew it was Hochspeyer, Germany. We had actually contacted someone to find out where that was. And we found out that it was going to be at St. Mary's Church in Hochspeyer, Germany. So we thought that should be very easy to find. So we drove down to Hochspeyer, Germany, and we looked for St. Mary's Church, and we couldn't find it. So we asked some locals where St. Mary's Church was, and they said there is no St. Mary's Church in Hochspeyer. And we said, no, we got information that we're certain that there is a St. Mary's Church here. No, it never has been. How about during World War II? No, there's never been a St. Mary's Church here. I said, was there a Catholic church here in town? Oh yeah, there's one Catholic church. We said, where is that? Maybe we'll go and take a look and see what happens there. So they told us where it was. It's St. Laurentius Church. We went to St. Laurentius Church, and we were just going to walk around it and then move on with the trip. And we saw two boys that were there. They were sort of riding their bicycles around the church as well. And they were kind of curious why we were there, and we were curious why they were there. So they stopped and they talked to us. One had a dad in Miami. That's where his dad lived. And the other was a Ukrainian boy who'd come over after the war started there. And we started talking to them. George speaks German, and so asked him a little bit about the church. Yeah, St. Laurentius Church. Said, it's locked right now. Is there any way to get in the church? Oh yeah, the kid said. You see the guy over at the picnic table drinking a beer with his friends? They're having lunch. He's the caretaker. You can ask him, and maybe they'll let you in. So the caretaker, when we asked him, said immediately, yes, absolutely, opened up the church for us. And we were looking in the church, the St. Laurentius Church, and we thought, why was it St. Mary? And then we looked at the sign as we went in, St. Laurentius Church, St. Mary's Parish. So we knew the connection was there. And as we went into the church, we went to the back of the church, and there was a baptismal font that was used during World War II. So as part of our excursion, just being able to bump into this and finding this baptismal font was incredibly special. And we felt lucky because, in each of these circumstances, we had to bump into people who were there to help us out. And it was interesting because as we thought about my dad over the course of the war, he was 29 years old when they were in Italy. He turned 30 during his time in France. And during that time, that's the photo from Avellino before he started battling. And this was a sketch of him in Germany 1 year later. And I don't know if you see it, but I see an incredible difference in just how he looks. He looks battle-hardened in the second picture to me. Yeah. And his arc during the war, at first, he in his letters, it's about uncertainty, not knowing what's going to come next. Then went to fighting, and then faith in God. And by the end, his letters were talking about the future. He wanted to take some courses in Grenoble. He wanted to see Milan. He wanted to have all these plans of what to do. So when he passed away in 2000, his funeral happened to be on May 7th, 2000. And at our father's funeral on May 7th, 2000, a 55-year-old man stood up to offer a eulogy. Good evening, he said. I would like to tell you a story. And he proceeded to talk about a conscripted laborer, a mess sergeant who knew a smattering of Polish, a company commander who organized a baptism. And the speaker closed with this. Today marks exactly 55 years, May 7th, 1945, since Gene first became a godfather. The Polish man has since died, about 4 years now. I can't help but feel that over the past few days, there has been a joyous, if not raucous, reunion between two very old and dear friends. One, a former Army first lieutenant. The other, a Polish immigrant. In closing, he continued, I would like to extend a wish to the Hammond children and grandchildren. I wish you the gift of strength of character, of integrity, of loyalty, courage, kindness, of personal commitment, and of honor. All of these were the hallmarks of your father, of your grandfather. And he paused and concluded, of my godfather. Thank you very much. And as a treat, it turns out that we were able to find out where this boy was. And he's going to join us right now from Mount Pleasant. Hi, Steve.
Oh, hello. I hope you hear me well.
This is Steve Glowacki. He is the boy who was baptized in Hochspeyer, Germany, St. Laurentius Church. And maybe I'll let him tell the story about how the family stayed connected. Steve, do you want to tell the story about how we stayed connected?
I would be very glad to. After the baptism, Lieutenant Hammond's crew, his company, kept on sweeping through Germany toward the war's end. After Germany surrendered, all the displaced people, they were called DPs, the displaced people were gathered by American troops, and they were housed in former German army barracks. And that's where my mom and dad and I stayed with hundreds of other people, because the German army barracks the compounds were very huge. Anyway, that was the last we saw of Gene after the baptism. A couple months later, actually about a year later, possibly a little bit longer, while we were in this German army barracks, we received a box of clothes, and it came from your dad, from Gene Hammond. And I could not believe that he located us. I mean, he did. It was remarkable. But anyway, we opened the box. There were clothes in there. My mother was overjoyed. We kept some clothes, and the rest of the clothes we shared with the other people living in the barracks. So anyway, time went on. And about like 1947 or so, there were 3 countries that were accepting displaced people. The countries were Argentina, of all places, Argentina, Canada, and Australia. England was kind of full of displaced people. The United States would accept displaced people, but only if they were sponsored by an American and the American sponsor had to ensure that when they came to America, they had a place to stay and they had a job. Well, wouldn't you know, about a year later, we had got a letter from Mr. Hammond. And again, I don't know how he found us, but he did. We got a letter from Mr. Hammond saying that he would be glad to sponsor us to come to America. My mother and dad were overjoyed. I mean, my gosh, oh, to America, can you believe that? But anyway, in order to do that, we had to go to a city called Koblenz, Germany. There, as a tentative immigrant to America, we had to go through a medical physical to make sure everybody was healthy. And after that, we secured the proper paperwork to keep on hand for when we were to leave Germany. In the meantime, your dad, Gene Hammond, secured a berth for us on a United States Army troop ship that was ferrying American soldiers from Germany to America, and then, hence fresh troops from America back to Germany. So we made our way to a city called Bremenhaven, which is a port in Germany, and we boarded this ship. It was the SS Marine Marlin, which was the troop ship. There were very few immigrant families aboard because, as I said, it was a troop ship, and it was mainly troops that were going back to the United States. And the journey, when we left Bremenhaven, took about 6 days to cross the Atlantic. And as we approached the New York Harbor, which was early in the morning, I remember my mama taking me out on deck because there were quite a few soldiers leaning against the rails already, because off in the distance were what looked to be like two tugboats with water hoses that were spraying these water arcs as a welcome, which was really quite a sight. And then as we looked to our left slightly, there was the Statue of Liberty, my gosh. And in the early morning mist, it looked greenish. But my mom started crying when she saw the Statue of Liberty. My dad, who was below decks, working with the crew preparing breakfast for everybody, came on deck, and he was just amazed. My gosh, we're in America. Anyway, the ship docked, we offloaded, went through immigration, and Mr. Hammond had secured a train ride for us, train tickets from New York to Kenosha, Wisconsin. When we arrived in Kenosha, Wisconsin, there was Mr. Hammond, along with his beautiful wife, Mrs. Patricia Hammond. And it was just unbelievable, the welcome we had. But anyway, we stayed with the Hammonds for about 4 or 5 days, where they took us around Kenosha and the vicinity just to show us everything. And after that, Mr. Hammond took us to the home that he secured for us, a rental. And my dad was going to work on one of the farms in Kenosha that was owned by a very wealthy person named Fritz Rudy. It's a very large farm. But anyway, my dad was a farmhand, and we lived in a farmhouse, and we owe it all to Mr. Hammond. And slowly, we did stay in contact with the Hammonds all along. And slowly we moved to another farmhouse, then finally into the city of Kenosha. And all the while, as I said, we were just staying in contact with the Hammonds because they were so graciously good to us. And that eulogy that I was asked to do for Mr. Hammond's, excuse me, I was getting a little emotional, but the the eulogy for Mr. Hammond was from the heart, because he was such a very, very good man. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer questions if there are any questions in the audience.
Great. Thank you, Steve. So we're going to all be here for answering questions, Steve.
Yeah, Steve, we can
Very well.
we can do the Q&A, and anybody who has a question, the cards are out there, and if you have something written, you can hand it to somebody who will collect them, and then we'll ask them. But let's start with any questions that someone has for Steve. Steve, you want to tell the story about the pictures that you got? Another part of our trip was we stopped at Dachau, just because it was near where our father had been.
It was on the route between Germany to Austria.
To Austria, where he had been, and we didn't know he had anything to do with it at all, but at Bill's lecture in Kenosha not too long ago, you told a story that connected our father to that as well. It was something our family didn't know anything about.
Well, as far as the concentration camp at Dachau, yes, the American soldiers, how can I say, penetrated the defenses, and they rescued the prisoners within the concentration camp of Dachau. And Mr. Hammond sent us some photographs that some of the soldiers in his unit had taken, black and white photographs. And as you can imagine, they were, at best for a little kid to see them, or for a mom and dad to see them, they were just gut-wrenching. And not too long ago, when I was speaking with the Hammond boys, they asked if I could mail them the photos, which I did. Now they've got evidence of the photos that Gene Hammond's soldiers took when they rescued some of those prisoners in Dachau.
Yeah. And as Bill said, our father never told us anything about it. So, any other questions? So, one of the reasons that besides the personal nature of this, is that your family was an immigrant family, brought, into America, and you want to say a little bit about what your family has achieved here in America?
Oh, sure.
Have you paid any taxes? Have you
Yeah. So, okay, with regard to my family, as I said, Mr. Hammond secured for us a place to live and employment, which was a requisite in order to immigrate to America. After 5 years of living on a farm, my dad working on a farm as a farmhand full-time, in addition to that, we were going to, my mom and dad that is, were going to evening classes to learn English and to kind of get ready to accept American citizenship. At the time, though, you had to, as I said, you have to be able to speak English, and you had to study the American Constitution. There were classes on that. So after studying the Constitutions and learning how to speak, they took a written test, and they passed, and they were granted American citizenship. So, and that was in 1955.
No to dobrze.
Pardon?
No to dobrze.
Dobrze, yes, that's Polish. Anyway, in 1955, they received their American citizenship, and I don't know if I mentioned this, but Mr. Hammond was the first mayor of Kenosha after Kenosha abandoned a city council form of government. He was the first elected mayor, and he served for 8 years. What a guy, hey, what a guy. But anyway, after getting the American citizenship, my dad applied for a job of all places, Nash Motor Company. also known later as American Motors in Kenosha. So he worked at Nash. And weekends, he worked on a farm because we still lived on a farm. After he made a little money, we moved into the city of Kenosha because my mom wanted to leave the farm. She was a city girl. In fact, she was from Warsaw, Poland. And at the time when she was detained by the Germans and shipped to Germany, she was a nursing student in Warsaw. But she was a city girl. So anyway, after living on a farm for years, I think she convinced my pops to move to the city, which we did. And we bought a little home in Kenosha. And from there, I went to a Catholic grade school, St. Casimir in Kenosha, which was run by, of all things, Catholic nuns. Can you believe that? And about the majority of them, they were Notre Dame nuns, but the majority spoke Polish. It was a Polish parish. It was called Święty Kazimierz, St. Casimir. Anyway, I slowly learned English because of the efforts of the nuns. And after graduating from St. Casimir's, I went on to St. Joseph's High School. My dad stayed with American Motors until he retired. And just a few years before Mr. Hammond passed away, my dad passed, and that's why I mentioned his passing in Mr. Hammond's eulogy.
We have a question in the audience.
Okay, great.
Here we go.
Hi. So I wanted to ask the gentleman on the screen. My mother's family were Polish refugees. They lost everything in World War II. And my mother was, my grandparents, my Oma and Opa, were put in a Russian prisoner of war camp, and the children just had to scatter to the winds. And my mother, through a total fluke, when she was a displaced person in Germany, was reunited with my grandparents who were in Bremenhaven at a refugee camp.
Oh, wow.
And I just have to think that maybe it was the same place you were. My mother met my father, who was an American GI, got married. My grandparents in Iowa sponsored what was left of my mother's family to come to the United States. And I mean, their journey isn't quite as dramatic, but it really reminds me in some ways of your journey, of your journey. And we tried at one point to go back to Poland to retrace the family, but even the names of the cities have changed, and the birth records and the marriage certificates. It was impossible for us to track the family down. But I'm very moved by what you told me. Thank you.
Ma'am, when you mentioned that your family was in Bremenhaven, my mom and dad didn't board the ship immediately. They had to stay there for about 2-3 days before the accommodations were made aboard the USS Marine Marlin. But God bless your mom and daddy for all that your family for all they endured.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments for Steve Glowacki? All right. Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Good man.
I appreciate that too, and God bless your family, and especially that saintly dad of yours. Thank you.
Ian, that was a great thing you did on Stalin at the last second. That was really a remarkable,
Impressive. Thank you.
remarkable item.
Thank you.
I hope Norman gets to watch it.
Oh, I hope he doesn't.
He'll say, no, wait a minute. All right, so if you have any questions, just hand it to Sophie, who's in the aisle there, and we will start the Q&A. So, Ian, you put together all of these sayings in their own words by Churchill and by FDR. You compiled them from a lot of different sources, I take it, yeah. So how much of a process was that? I mean, was it something that you were familiar with? Because this isn't your you're a deep history guy. This is only 80 years ago. So tell us a little bit about the process that you went through to put that together, because that was a remarkable, insight into how three guys, and we intentionally wanted those three leaders thinking the way they were thinking, and then to put a personal story about what happens to the people who actually have to do what these guys tell you to do, right? So now tell us a little bit about the process, because that couldn't have been easy.
Well, I don't know if I should confess this. For the first time in my life, I asked ChatGPT what it was. And I got to say, it was terrible what it came up, absolutely terrible. And so I don't have a lot of experience with AI stuff. I have this sort of almost religious opposition to it. I think it's been created solely to destroy my life, which is probably going to turn out to be true. So anyway, various people explained to me how you could use it to get much more constructive answers. And in fact, one guy even showed me a little bit of what you could do to get it much more focused on what you wanted. And I just thought, nah, I'll just make something up. And so, of course, I sound like this total technophobe, but something like this is so much easier now because of the internet, and especially for Roosevelt and Churchill. Everything they ever said is out there online. And so the problem was actually just this superfluity of stuff. And so then the challenge became, how do I narrow it down to some sort of coherent theme? It actually didn't take super long to do it, but it was a bit of a challenge to think, well, what would they want to say? And this is probably not what they would want to say, but what am I interested in about what they would want to say?
Now, I think it's fascinating how, especially the way you presented it, how they all were measuring each other either inaccurately or accurately, and thinking how I'm going to get the best in the negotiation. They probably all thought they were the best negotiators ever.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating story about the various peace conferences. And there's this game, I don't know if any of you know about this, there's a company called GMT Games that makes board games, and they've made one called Churchill, which is about these three guys and their wartime conferences. And it's a really cleverly designed game. It draws you into it, and I don't know if it has any real bearing on reality at all, but it feels very real. Where you negotiate these different issues, and you have to try to get at least one of the others behind you on the various issues, and it's in their interest to do so up to a point, and then it ceases to be in their interest. And so that's probably colored my perception of this as well.
Another question is, what was the reality behind FDR feeling soft for the Russians because they had suffered so much? I mean, how aware were the Americans that the Russians were suffering? How early did we find out, for example, that 20 million Russians died in the war?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the number 20 million, I mean, this is kind of a made-up number, an estimate. I mean, nobody's ever going to know how many people died in the Soviet Union during the war. The numbers, it rapidly outran people's ability to count and interest in counting. The scale of the killing, even a lot of the German killers were sickened by what they were seeing. At one point fairly early in the war, it was just decided, the Germans were deciding we want to get rid of these subhuman Slavic populations in Russia so we can turn it into a fresh land where German colonists can go out and farm the land. And Germans had no interest in doing this. They want to get all these city boys to go off and farm in the middle of Ukraine. Germans got zero interest in doing this. We've got to get rid of the millions of these subhumans. So we'll round them up, we'll put them in camps, we'll just stop feeding them. What could go wrong? And they quickly discover, one of the sort of many nasty details about world history, when we talk about things like the Irish potato famine or whatever, very few people actually starve to death. Disease is what kills you. As you get weaker and weaker, of course, you get more and more vulnerable to disease. So I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but it is true. I think it's only in the several million people who died in the Irish potato famine, only a few thousand actually starved. Everybody else succumbs to disease. And so this is what the Germans find. And they also find that if you stand next to a barbed wire encampment full of people dying of diseases, you're going to die of disease as well. And so they were sickened by the scale of the terror and the horror that they were unleashing on these populations.
Now let's get a little bit of optimism from deep history then. So the 20th century was devastating in terms of how many people got killed in those two world wars or through the diseases and everything like that. And the estimates are from 100 million to 250 million or something like that. But the fact is that in 1900, there were under 2 billion people, and at the end of the century, there was over 6 billion people. So something went right that century, in terms of numbers for humanity that hadn't happened in a lot of other places. But I remember from a talk that you gave long ago on the deep history, was that if you go back 10,000 years and you look at the archaeological evidence, it looks like 10% to 20% of the people died violently, and now it's under 1%. So why don't you talk about that? Whatever mass killing we've done, on the general way that people live life. Why don't you explain that? Because I think it's a very important thing to find out about what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of joy and optimism and cheer in deep history, it's got to be said. If you're looking for a fun time, you do something else. But it is full of really, really surprising facts that you're never going to grasp unless you look at the really broad span and you put things into perspective. So yeah, I mean, there's never been anything like the two world wars in the whole previous history of humanity, especially the Second World War. The scale of the killing and the devastation, the starvation, just incomprehensible. And yet, when people write general histories of the 20th century, most historians find it very difficult, to come to a single, simple summation of what the 20th century was about. And you'll all know the classic opening line of Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And this is very much what the 20th century was. That it was the more people died violently in the 20th century than probably in the entirety of human history up to 1914. So, horrifying. And things like the German concentration camps, of course there'd been stuff like that before. And in fact, the word concentration camp, as I'm sure many of you will know again, it comes from what the British set up during the Boer War in South Africa, only a lifespan before the First World War. The scale of the horror that was unleashed on the world really didn't have any close parallels in earlier history. And yet, as George says, the outcome of the 20th century is that now, by its end, there were 3 or 4 times as many people in the world as existed at the beginning. On average, and this is talking globally now, not just about the rich countries, on average, everybody in the world was living 30 years longer than they would have done if they'd been born a century earlier. On average, they were growing to be 4 inches taller than they would have been a century earlier because nutrition was so much better. On average, they were earning something like 7 times as much each as they would have been doing in real terms as they would have been doing a century earlier. And so we've got this really, really peculiar story of what's gone on. We've killed, during the whole of the 20th century, warfare, murder, all the other forms of violent death, probably several 100 million people, 300 million, maybe more than that, died during the 20th century. But something like 10 billion people with a B lived during the 20th century. And the likelihood of you dying violently during the 20th century, even though we had the 2 world wars and the only use of nuclear weapons so far, you were 10 times less likely to die violently as you would have done if you'd lived in the Stone Age. This extraordinary kind of statistic, there's so many more of us, the world is so much more productive, and when we're not actively going out trying to kill each other, the world is so much more peaceful than it's ever been before. And I think that the two things, the scale of the death in the wars and the sort of general decline of rates of violent death kind of go together, because it seems to me the thing that has driven down the scale of killing has actually been governments. As governments have got stronger and stronger, governments are mostly run by really, really awful people who don't care about us. Whatever they say, they don't care about us. What they care about, and this is more true in the past than it is now, but it's still a bit true. But particularly in the past, governments were run by the masters of violence, the people who were able to wield violence more effectively than anybody else in the society. And what they would do is, I'm the king, right? Okay, and you're my people. I look out at you people and say, what I want you to do is go back to your farms and work really hard and grow lots of wheat and pay taxes so that I can have a palace filled with virgins and I can bathe in the milk of mares and drink champagne all day long, just like Churchill did. And it's all going to be fabulous. What I don't want is you quarreling with each other and burning each other's farms down and killing each other's animals and murdering each other. I do not want that. So I'm going to have some kind of security apparatus to basically scare you straight. You're so scared of what my guys can do to you that you would rather forego killing your neighbor than risk unleashing the violence of the state on you. And we've got this long run pattern going on at least 5,000 years of governments getting more and more able to pacify the populations that they rule. But at the same time, as they get more and more powerful, of course, they're able to unleash more and more violence on other states. So this weird kind of combination of the number of wars that get fought has generally been going down for at least 200 years. And the number overall, the proportion of people who die violently in the world goes down. But when it does go wrong, our ability to kill is now sort of off the charts. And some good news. You wanted good news, didn't you? I forgot. Some good news. So if we had lived in 1980, well, we did, but all of us, I think, probably. In 1986, when I was a young man, that was the year when the world's nuclear arsenals reached their peak. There are more than 70,000 nuclear warheads in the world. Nobody knows for certain what would have happened if they'd been used. But Andrei Sakharov, the Soviet dissident, he was pretty confident. He was a physicist. He was pretty confident that would have been enough to destroy all of humanity in one day. And maybe enough to end life on this planet in one day. Now we've got a lot less nukes. There's probably, it depends how you count, there's probably under 10,000 usable nuclear warheads in the world right now. If we had a nuclear war now, we could not end life on this planet in one day. We're working hard to build them again. After 40 years when the trends were all heading in the right direction, now governments are starting to rebuild them again. But the good news is we can no longer end life on this planet in one day. And that's really sad, isn't it?
Such
That's
good
the
news,
happiest
Ian.
news I don't know why you invited me. I don't.
So here's a question for Mr. Hammond. You've given this lecture several times, and the question is, why do you volunteer and go out and give this lecture? You mentioned a little bit about trying to inspire people to look into their own family histories, but why don't you say a little bit more about that?
I think that's the best reason, that there are a lot of people that we care about, and there are a lot of people that we like to connect with. Family is often the group that we like to connect with most. Sometimes I'm just thinking about it in terms of parents. Sometimes we look at our parents just as mom and dad and not as people. And they are people, and they went through all sorts of experiences, all of which changed how they worked with us. And so I think the more you can find out about your parents or your siblings or friends that you really care about, the better off you are.
Mm-hmm. All right. Another one for Ian. Since you're able to bring positivity to that we're not going to die in one day anymore. How do you think the war in Ukraine will end? And when?
Yeah.
Sometime in the next century, right?
Do you want me to take this one?
Sure, yeah. Be my guest.
I think find out about your families and just find out about their history and follow their footsteps. I'm sorry, that's not really a good answer.
I think it's a pretty good one. Oh, you're looking at me again. Okay.
Well, you don't need
to.
You don't need to answer that one, but
Yeah, we don't.
You don't have any information.
No, I think the thing with the kind of work I do, I look at these great big trends playing out across thousands and thousands of years, try to see what these trends are, what kind of forces can potentially derail them, and then think about where they might lead if they don't get derailed. And I think it actually is a really good way of thinking about what might happen in the future, as long as you stay on this really abstract sort of level. And the more you burrow down into the details of what what actual real people like your dad did, the less this is able to help you. And I was sort of called before a meeting of this group called the Mackinder Forum a few weeks ago to sort of answer for myself and talk about how many of the predictions I've made in my books seem to have bared any relationship to the truth. And I'd sort of known all along that what I did, I felt sort of did work on this sort of broad level, and the more you get down into personal things, the less well it worked. But thinking about it for that, it really drove the point home that the more scope there is for one person to change the outcome of a story just by some little thing they did. I mean, like your dad, the story with your dad, any one of all these people in it could have just done one thing differently and it would have all turned out completely differently. Whereas a lot of the really big things in history, it's very, very difficult to derail them. And often I think when you think about them, you ask sort of counterfactual questions like, what would have happened if somebody done something different? Well, let's say, what would have happened if we hadn't had Adolf Hitler or he died in his cradle or something? Would we have had World War II? And I think definitely the answer, we would not have had the World War II that we got. But would we have had some kind of conflict centered on Europe, centered on the fallout from the Treaty of Versailles? I think even without Hitler, there's a really good chance something like that was going to happen. Would it have involved genocides? Almost certainly. You want to be depressed. You think I'm depressing. I'm not depressing. There's this guy, Tim Snyder, a historian. I don't know if any of you know him, wrote this book called one gentleman nodding in the front, Bloodlands, which is a story of the zone that the Soviets and the Germans fought over in the Second World War. And quite a lot of it is about the genocides and the concentration camps. And he's got these just heartbreaking stories. One Jewish family in Poland who were interned, I think it was in Auschwitz by the Germans, and then the Soviets come in, they liberate them, they're out of Auschwitz. Stalin puts them back in Auschwitz. They reopen the camp after the war as a place to house undesirables, where lots and lots of them die. I mean, just those terrible, terrible things going on. I mean, would something like that have happened even without Hitler? Got a strong suspicion it might well have done. Would we have ended up in the sort of globalized, interconnected world that we've got now, even if the Second World War had not happened? I think it's very, very likely we would. But would my mother and father, you were asking about this earlier, would my mother and father have met at a dance for coal miners at Trentham Gardens? Highly likely not.
Yeah.
God, I wouldn't be here. Oh my God. What would you do this afternoon?
Well, here's a big picture, not quite deep, but almost deep history one. And that question is about, also related to Ukraine a little bit, but it's about the Russians and the Chinese. So the Russians and the Chinese have been having this back and forth. I mean, if you can go back to Genghis, you can go back to Attila, and you can, et cetera. They've been going back and forth. And it seems like the Russians are in a situation where they're a little bit dependent on the Chinese. The Chinese are the productive ones again. They're not staying out of world culture and world industry and all that anymore, and they're taking back the position they've had for most of the last 3,000 years, as you've written about. So do you think that the long-term, or at least the next 200 years or 300 years, is that the outcome will be that China will take over some of Siberia and stuff like that in payment for what they're due for Russia, that kind of thing? Is that on the agenda?
Yeah, really interesting question. I mean, one of the big concerns that a lot of strategy people in the US had when it became clear that Putin wasn't in fact going to take over Ukraine in the first week or so, which is what most people thought, when that didn't happen, one of the big concerns was if Putin comes out of this too badly, this is really going to push Russia and China together more than ever before. And one of the many things, of course, the US would deeply like to avoid happening is for Russia and China to just develop more and more interests, to be able to work together more cohesively against American interests. And I mean, some of you might remember this during I think late in 2022, Henry Kissinger, who at that point I think was like 99 or something, still getting himself into trouble, 99 years old. He starts saying, the last thing we want is for the Ukrainians to really win this war. That would be terrible, because that is going to push Russia and China together. What we really want is for this war just to go on and on and on. And it's going to drain the Russians, bankrupt them, expose all the stupidities of the way their system works. And And we wanted to sort of drag on in such a way that it will become awkward and embarrassing for Xi Jinping to embrace Vladimir Putin too closely. Like Putin, it would be like he's shackled to a corpse or something, that Xi Jinping won't want to be too closely allied to Russia. And you can imagine, of course, how everybody reacts when Henry Kissinger says this particularly cold and heartless thing. They all say, oh, yeah, well, that's what we'd expect from Henry Kissinger. But the cold and heartless thing is, of course, for American interests, maybe that is what I think a lot of American strategists are thinking. The best outcome here is not a sharp victory for Ukraine, not having Ukraine join NATO, not having it join the EU, but kind of what we've currently got. So again, as cynical and horrible as I might sound, I'm so much less bad than
Henry Kissinger.
Yeah. I know if that's where you set your bar, that is pretty shameful.
You're going to do really well.
I'm better than Henry Kissinger.
Bill, you spent a year in Poland. Mm-hmm. What did that get caused at all by the family connection to this Polish family, or were you unaware of it?
I knew about the connection, but it wasn't talked about strongly. I was able to do a Fulbright in Poland and teach high school over there, and there was a Polish high school teacher who taught in my school. We just switched places.
What year?
That was 91, 92.
91, uh-huh.
Yeah, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall,
right.
which was one of the reasons I wanted to go there. Mm-hmm. A couple things happened that caused that. One, my first choice was to go to Egypt. And then the Persian Gulf War started. So Fulbright decided not to send anybody to Egypt. And my second choice was Poland, in part because I knew we were getting a lot of information about Poland through the newspapers, and I knew it was inaccurate or very narrowly defined. So I thought that would be a great place to go to, some place in the world that I knew very little about.
If there are any more questions, we're down to like one or two more. So. Was FDR truly present in the negotiations in Yalta, or was he almost gone?
Yeah, well, he's sitting there, but was he following it? There's a lot of argument about that. He agreed to some just extraordinary things. And, certainly a lot of his advisors were very, very unhappy about the way that went. Churchill was furious. Stalin, I assume, was very, very happy.
So this is my question. So did Henry Kissinger advise FDR on what he should do at Yalta?
God, that's interesting. What would Kissinger have said? I think Kissinger probably did write something about this. I mean, he wrote volumes.
Eventually, yeah.
So he probably did write. What would he have advised? I don't know.
All right.
Great question. I'm going to go away and think about that.
Yes, Bill.
Could I ask you a question? Now, I've told this story of something that the both of us and another brother went on. Is there something from the story that I tell that is missing that you would like to add to it?
Well, you edited the details wonderfully.
Yeah.
So no, I have nothing to add. It was a great version of the story. It was 3 weeks.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. Actually, the conversations in the car for the 3 weeks were a very interesting part of the whole thing. But we will end on one question, and this is, I've saved this for the end. Because you're British, was Churchill really so off base about wanting to continue the British Empire? After all, France and the Netherlands didn't want to give up their colonies either. Do you think that the world would be a better place if the British Empire were still in charge?
Ooh.
You don't have to answer that question, but just, Americans want to know.
The British Empire was finished by the 1940s. There was no way. It was a sort of out of time and place kind of organization. And this is the famous line people use about the British Empire being created in a fit of absent-mindedness. And there's a certain amount of truth in that almost no one at any point, at least early on, was sitting down saying, we're going to create this empire, and it's going to, the sun will never set, it'll girdle the entire globe, it's going to do this, that, and the other. It was cobbled together by people with very, very different interests doing very, very different sorts of things. On the whole, people in the British government fought desperately not to have an empire. They were forever telling what they would call the men on the spot, the guys who are out there in the Punjab or wherever they are, and they're forever telling them, do not conquer stuff. And these guys go out there and they conquer stuff, because then you can steal everything. You kill a lot of people and you steal things. And then you write back to London saying, oops, I seem to have conquered something. And the British government will try desperately to get out, and they regularly sort of retreat from the conquest, because it's expensive. Like they want to advance British power. They want to make the British Isles richer. They want to make themselves more powerful within the government. And there's a number of different tools out there at your disposal to do that. Conquest is one, but trade is another one. Other kinds of ways of extracting minerals and moving people around. There's a lot of different ways you can do this, and the British are actively involved in all of them. Conquest is like just one tool in the toolkit, and on the whole, it's one that the soldiers like, and it's one that the government that has to pay for it doesn't like. and well, I just tell one story. I know I tend to tell one story. There's this guy, Namir, was it? But he's a general in India in, I think, the 1850s, and there's trouble in the Punjab in Pakistan, and he is sent to go out and deal with this trouble and reorganize the province of Sindh, S-I-N-D-H it's spelt, which is the old Muslim name for this area of India. Reorganize Sindh into an area, very fertile area, rivers flowing through it, reorganize it in such a way that will be of benefit to the British position in India, will increase the wealth of the British position in India, and will act as a buffer zone so that the British don't have to go and get involved in Afghanistan again. Because everybody knows, don't get involved in Afghanistan. And so this is Namir's job. And so what does he do? He goes out there and he conquers it. And he conquers the province of Sindh. And he knows he's going to be in trouble because he has been explicitly told, do not do this. But he does it. And so he sends a one-word telegram back to his bosses in London. And these guys, again, it's the 1850s, they've all been to Eton and Harrow, been extensively educated in the classics. They know Latin and Greek better than the Romans and Greeks knew Latin and Greek. It says this one-word telegram back to London, and it says, Pekawi. And the guys back in London, they look and they say, Pekawi, what is he talking about? And then one bright spark says, Pekawi, that's Latin. That is Latin for, I have sinned. Ooh. And actually, the story is not true. It's a fabulous, it should be true. It was made up by a schoolgirl. It should be true. But anyway, this was the problem the British had. They sort of coupled this empire together. It was never entirely clear what it was supposed to do, how it was supposed to work. And people would say in the 19th century, they say there were four pillars to Britain's world position. One was possession of the empire itself, particularly India. India is one of the four pillars. The Royal Navy is the second pillar, protecting free trade that Britain needs around the world. Third pillar was British domination of finance and shipping and insurance and everything coming out of London. And the fourth pillar was something else. Oh, the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, of course, Britain is able to make more goods better and more cheaply than anyone else in the world. And these four things together make these tiny little group of islands the greatest power in the world. And you've got to have all four. And the problem is by 1945, Britain is no longer the center of the world's shipping and industry and insurance business. This has been destroyed by the Second World War. Britain is no longer the world's industrial powerhouse the United States of America is. Britain has not yet lost India, but it's about to lose India. The empire itself is an anachronism. And one of the sort of the weirder things when you read government's memos within the government to each other, they're writing to each other at this point, is almost none of them, with the possible exception of Winston Churchill, thinks they're actually going to hold on to the empire. What they are doing, it really is very sort of Kissinger-y, but quite clever. They're saying we've got to do two things. for some reason, the Americans are obsessed with the Soviet Union, and they've got this new idea about containment. So we have to persuade them that everything we do is part of the American containment strategy. And so the British go out of their way to identify communists in Nigeria and Malaysia and other places that are fighting the British Empire. And actually, in Malaya, they were communists, but usually they weren't. But the British go to these ridiculous lengths to paint these people as communists to try to get the Americans on board with shooting them. And so that's one thing that they do. The other thing that they do is they say, okay, there's all these people organizing against us out in the colonies. What we've got to do is pick the good natives, which is the phrase they use, the good natives, as opposed to the bad natives. And you identify your good native, somebody like Nkrumah in the Ivory Coast in Ghana. You put him in jail so that everyone will think he's a hero. He's not our man, he's your man, because we put him in jail. Then you let him back out of jail. And then you try to make sure that he likes us. And then you let them all go and have their own country, and they will come to us for their financing and their trade and their shipping and everything else. And it will actually potentially be more profitable than the British Empire was. It will actually be better for us to shed the empire. Because it doesn't turn out like that. It's a complete fantasy. But it would be very clever. If it hadn't been nonsense, it would have been... But no, I think the short answer is that there was no way for the British Empire to persist. It's actually extraordinary that some parts of it, the British hung on as long as they did.
Now it's an even better explanation of the British Empire than in The Life of Brian by Monty Python. What have the Romans ever done for us?
Wine.
Anyway, thank you very much for coming, and we will have our next one in February about Ansel Adams. Thank you, Kay. And also then in March, Emma of Normandy, and then next July, the 250th anniversary, if we still have our freedom. All right, thank you very much for coming.